Hey, folks. This is Charles Max Wood. I usually say Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. I've had a lot of people ask me what my story is as far as getting into podcasting. Now, just to give a little bit of background here, I'm probably going to turn this into a podcast. The show title I'm looking at right now is The Podcast Laboratory. And what I'm looking at doing is just talking about podcasting in general. So, podcast laboratories, I'll probably bring other podcasters in and talk about that kind of thing. I'm going to talk about my own experience with podcasting, how I run my podcasts. And then I'm also going to set up the Podcast Assembly Line podcast, where we talk a little bit more about the actual nuts and bolts on how we do editing, how we do show notes and things like that. And then Podcasters Clearinghouse. I had a friend of mine that was giving me a bad time about podcast stuff, and he mentioned that, and I was like, that's great, I'm using it. So Podcasters Clearinghouse is going to be about monetization. So anyway, I'm going to jump in here really quickly and just talk a bit about my story. Now, I've been in podcasting for 10 years, so there's a lot to talk about, a lot to go through, and the reason that I'm putting it on this particular show is primarily because I want to talk about just podcasting in general and what it's like to be a podcaster in the podcasting laboratory or the podcaster's laboratory. So that's where we're at. So let me just get right to it. The first part, I'm really just going to talk about how I got into podcasts in general. And then next time I'll talk about how I got into podcasting itself. But the first thing that I wanted to talk about was just, how did I get into podcasting? Well, I have a degree in computer engineering from Brigham Young University, that's in Provo, Utah. And while I was studying there, I decided that I needed to go out and get an actual job. And I thought that I was going to be getting a job doing some kind of IT work because I had 6 years of experience doing IT work at the university. And I figured that it would be a natural transition to go and find a job where I was doing that kind of work. So I started applying around to different jobs, and I wound up at a company called Mozy. That's M-O-Z-Y. I think it's currently owned by EMC Corporation. That's who bought it when I was there. I think EMC Corporation got bought by Dell. So anyway, it's somewhere in their portfolio of companies at this point. That doesn't really matter. What matters is, so I got hired in. I was the 11th employee at Mozy. And it was really kind of a superstar company in its space, did online backup. And I got in working on support for their customers. I worked with another guy named Tom, and Tom just couldn't keep up with all the work. So, and it was because the company was growing so quickly. So I came in, we started working on things together, and at the time, and the reason that I'm starting clear back here is going to become apparent as I explain. So as I worked with Tom, it became apparent that we weren't going to be able to keep up. We were going to, again, have to hire people or do something different. And we were mostly just answering emails using Thunderbird, Mozilla Thunderbird, which is kind of like Outlook or things like that if you're not familiar with it. But we were just opening up emails and answering them. We would run into problems where he'd start answering one and I'd start answering one, and then one of us would have to throw away 10 minutes of work, or we'd have to wait for it to send, and then we'd have to go and get the next one and make sure that we weren't stepping on each other's toes. So it kind of became this issue. And as a computer engineering major, I was proficient at programming. I wasn't super good at it, but I was proficient. I could do it. And Tom he enjoyed programming. So we started working together on a system that would allow us to pull the emails out of the email server, put them into a database, and then we could answer them more quickly. And if Tom was working on an email, then it would lock that email out for me for 10 minutes so that Tom could work on it and finish it. And so when I'd finish one, it would skip the one he was working on and bring the next one up for me. And so we wound up actually vastly increasing our productivity doing that. And that was what really got me into software development. And most of my shows were about software development, which is where this all ties in, is that I got this really deep love for software development and Ruby on Rails, which is the framework that we were using to build the application that allowed us to answer the email so quickly. So I get into programming, and I wound up taking over the entire support department. I wound up taking over most of the development for this system. Tom started it. He did a lot of the work initially, and then I just kind of worked my way into it. So I was really into Ruby on Rails. I really enjoyed it. And to summarize, after a while, we had 20 or 30 people working for us in the support department, which made us the largest department in the company. And we were also the lowest paid department in the company because software developers get paid more, executives get paid more. But there started to be some political wrangling, especially when the company got acquired by EMC. So I wound up spending a lot more time working on this system because I could streamline a lot of things by building systems into this. It was a web-based system, but building into this web-based system to make things work. And after a while, there was enough political wrangling to where I had a conversation with my boss. He wanted to promote the guy that was my assistant manager over all these people to my position for political reasons. And so he was trying to find a way to, move me along. The other thing is that I was telling him, I was like, look, this is how our traffic's growing, which means that our team's going to have to grow at the same rate, or we're going to have to start doing things differently. And here are some ideas. And he didn't really want to hear that because it meant asking corporate for more money. So what wound up happening was I moved over to QA. And when I moved over to QA, I had asked to be put on the software development team, and I was told no because I was too new. But I could work in QA. So I wound up working with a guy named Don. And Don was this cool guy. He lived up in Ogden. Mosey was based in Pleasant Grove. It's probably about an hour and a half to 2 hour drive one way to drive from Ogden to Pleasant Grove. And so what Don would do is he would drive down, he would stay down here for the week, and then he would drive home. And in order to pass the time, he bought an iPod. And I'm glossing over a whole bunch of details and all the personal stuff that went on, but essentially that's how I got introduced to podcasts, was that we shared an office. And so I'd be sitting there and I'd be working on the Mac Mini, helping run the Mac beta, and then I would test the software whenever they released it. And Tom was the other guy I worked with. Don would be sitting in the other desk and he'd be cracking up about something that he heard on a podcast. And so finally I turned around and I was like, dude, what are you laughing at? What are you, what's so funny? Oh, well, I was listening to this podcast and they said something funny. And he was way into like Grammar Girl and, some of the older shows, some of the, the early shows that were out there on podcasts. And so I was like, oh, well, that sounds great, but I can't afford an iPod, so I'm not going to be able to listen to podcasts. And of course, he's like, you have that Mac Mini sitting on your desk. And so I wound up coming to work every day and I'd plug my headphones into the Mac Mini, open up iTunes, and listen to the podcasts I was subscribed to. And I was really into Ruby on Rails and started listening to a show called Rails Envy, which was done by Jason Seifer and Greg Pollock. And Greg's still out there doing podcasts. Currently, if you go listen to the official Vue podcast, I can't remember exactly what's called, Vue News, I think. That's VUE, which is another programming framework. He does that. And he started a company called Code School and sold it to another company called Pluralsight. If you're not in the programming space, you don't really need to know what they're programmer training websites. Anyway, so I was listening to the show and I was like, this sounds like fun. This looks like something that I would enjoy doing. And so I emailed Greg and I was like, hey, Greg, what would it take to start a podcast? I'm new to programming. I've never done anything like podcasting before. And I thought that podcasters were these kind of web celebrities. And the way that my friend was talking about some of the people that he was listening to, like Mignon Fogarty on Grammar Girl and things like that that they kind of were. And he emailed me back the next day and he's like, that is a great idea. You should totally start a show. And I emailed him back and I said, well, I don't really know what to do. And so he reached back out and he said, well, why don't you interview people and just talk about what you're working on when you don't know what to talk about or you don't have a guest. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool. And so he started helping me get introduced to people that I had seen at the programming conferences, because by then I was involved in the Ruby on Rails community here in Utah. And so I interviewed Greg as episode 1. I think I talked about some project I was working on for episode 2 of that show. And then I interviewed another guy named James Gray for episode 3, and so on and so forth. And I think my 50th episode, I interviewed David Heinemeier Hansen, who's one of the co-founders of Basecamp. He's also the creator of the Ruby on Rails framework, which was what I was programming in at the time. But yeah, that's, I guess I went into how I got into podcasting, but that was basically it. So every week I would record something, and half the time I'd record something over Skype with somebody else, and the other half of the time I would talk about whatever project I had. And that was how I got into podcasting. Now there's a little bit more to the story as far as how I got really going, but that was essentially it. I just started talking to people and never really stopped. So I'm going to end here, and then in the next episode I'll talk a little bit more about how that podcast grew and some of the things that really made it go from being a hobby to being a little bit more than a hobby. And eventually I'll get around to where now I'm full-time making podcasts and running a podcasting company. So stay tuned for all of that. But yeah, that's how I got into podcasting. That's how I got into both listening to podcasts and producing them.